I'm here trying to give you a bit of a different view of my apartment. You can ignore my crappy bookshelf behind me and focus your attention on the whiteboard. What I'm going to do is give you one lecture on the chapter called Terror, and then a second lecture on the chapter called Disconnection. And then I might do a lecture on the Dorothy Allison and the poetry that I've posted for this week. So there might be 3 lectures this week instead of the 2, and I apologize for breaking my promise. I said there would only be 2, but there needs to be more for this onslaught of information. Alright, so without further ado, let me get started with the chapter on terror. And the way that I wanted to work through this chapter, I know that you are all going to take your own individual interests that reflect your theme research. So I was just going to run us through what this chapter specifically tells us about the after effects, or what trauma affects. What are the consequences? What are the results? What actually happens to the human body, to the human mind, after a traumatic event? Excuse me. So I'm just going to go through page by page here, and I've got the page numbers on the left, and then a short summary of the actual effect of the trauma. So we start on page 33, which is the first page of the chapter, and the 2 things that this page shows us is that trauma affects ordinary systems of care and ordinary adaptations to life. And so in the first paragraph, the last sentence in that first paragraph reads, "Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning." And so the second part of it, that ordinary adaptations to life, that's that third paragraph that begins, "Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life." And these 2 will start to make more sense as we go through the rest of this chapter, but I want you to particularly pay attention to the fact that trauma overwhelms people and affects all facets of their ability to control, their ability to connect, and their ability to make meaning. That's going to become so important to us as we work through this course, and as we work through our own personal traumas and the reading of other people's traumas, because if that person is having a difficult time making meaning, if that person is having a difficult time controlling what they're thinking or how they're behaving, if that person is having a difficult time making connections to the real world, then it is no wonder that the trauma narratives that that person produces, the poetry, the stories, the oral tales that the traumatized person produces, is confusing and fragmented, because they're having a hard time connecting meaning and controlling meaning. Okay, so the second one is on page 34, just a page over. And here we see that trauma affects physiological arousal, emotion, cognition, and memory. You'll go down to that second full paragraph that begins, "Traumatic reactions occur when action is of no avail." About midway through that paragraph, you see the sentence, "Traumatic events produce profound and lasting changes in physiological arousal, emotion, cognition, and memory." Down to the next page, page 35, we see that trauma next affects the synthesizing function of the mind. That's that first full sentence on page 35 that reads, "He wrote," and here they're talking about Genet, "he wrote of the dissolving effects of intense emotion which incapacitated the synthesizing function of the mind." Okay, so let me pause here and say a little bit about this idea of synthesis, okay? We know that in critical thinking classes like this one, like most of the classes that you're going to take at EKU, professors are really trying to drive you toward critical thought, to drive you toward making connections between things. So the way that I try to conduct our event board, I try to help you make connections between and among all of the different texts that we read, because that is forcing you to take what is fragmented in the form of 2 or 3 different articles and a poem and part of a novel and a link that I posted online. You've got all of these pieces out here in front of you. So your job is to analyze each one, but then at the end I ask you to actually bring those together in conversation with one another. So I am asking you to do the very thing that trauma survivors have difficulty doing, which is take the fragmented pieces of their life and synthesize them into some sort of cohesive narrative, right? And so the synthesizing function of the mind that has been tampered with by trauma is the very thing that we're trying to work on in this class. We're trying to develop our own synthesis skills so that when we're faced with trauma, so that when we're recovering from our own trauma, so that when we're faced with other people's trauma, we already have some of that practice putting things back together, things that maybe weren't supposed to be put together in the first place, like Herman's book and Dorothy Allison's chapter and the poems that we might read. Sure, they seem disconnected, but when we look at them more closely and we put our analytical mind to the task, we find that we are able to synthesize those things and find how they're put into conversation with one another. So I'm not just doing it, to be doing it. I'm really thinking through one thing that I can train you guys to do over the course of the semester that might bolster that synthesizing function of the mind, so that when you encounter trauma, you already have a tool in your toolkit to face that. On pages 35 and 36, we see that trauma not only affects the synthesizing function of the mind and memory and cognition and normal adaptation, but it also affects the nervous system. Okay, so here's where we get into that psychosomatic connection. How is it that something that just happens to us mentally, that something that just, maybe something that we see or something that we experience, someone's, even just through reading someone else's trauma narrative, how is it that that can affect our very core, the very essence of our being, our nervous system? That is so fascinating, but it gets into that psychosomatic connection, and it starts to help us understand how traumatized people who are reliving events solely inside of their mind and who have no real lasting physical expression of that damage, they can still manifest these symptoms in their bodies through their nervous system. So the mind tells the nervous system that there's a pain, and the mind agrees with the nervous system, and before long you're telling yourself as a traumatized person the story of your own pain, the story of your own trauma, and you believe yourself. It's really, really messed up and convoluted, but I hope that you're starting to see the way that the stories that we tell ourselves actually can affect us, so much so that our nervous system responds. That's pretty intense. Page 39 is the next part that mentions the effects of trauma, and here we see trauma's effect on neurophysiological organization. I actually misspelled this on the board. I put neuropsychological, but we're talking here, if you look on page 39, at the end of that first paragraph, the sentence reads, "Thus, in sleep as well as in waking life, traumatic memories appear to be based in an altered neurophysiological organization." So the neurophysiological, the mind-body organization, even that is, as we saw with the last synthesizing function of the mind and the nervous system, even the connection between the mind and the body is somehow altered or somehow dismantled, so that the traumatized person has to create new connections there. But as we saw earlier, they have a really difficult time making connections. So all of this training that we're doing for to synthesize comes in handy when a person becomes traumatized, because they're able, whereas they might not be able to on their own make connections, training in synthesis helps to begin forming those connections. Sorry if I'm not making myself very clear. As you know, this material really excites me and makes me excited, and makes me happy, so sometimes it's hard to get my words out. Alright, let's keep moving through. See how much time I have. We're on page 41 at this point, and this is really interesting to me, that that trauma affects what is being called here the internal schemata. Alright, so we're looking at the paragraph that begins, "More recent theorists also conceptualize intrusion phenomenon." It's that third full paragraph on the page. The last sentence of that paragraph reads, "The trauma is resolved only when the survivor develops a new mental schema for understanding what has happened." If you look up a little bit farther, it says trauma, by definition, shatters internal schemata. And a schemata is just a way to look at the world. It's a way of knowing the world. We all have internal schematas that organize the way that we take in information and help us organize that information to make sense of things. And most people who are not, traumatized on a severe level, we share a very similar schemata. Like I used the example earlier, we all know that cars are going to drive on the right side of the road. We all know that when people go into restaurants, they're going to sit down and they're going to eat. They're not going to dance on the table. We have these internal schemata that organize the way that society works and the way that we fit into society. But when trauma affects all of the things that it's affecting, it also affects the makeup and the organization of these internal schemata. It affects one's ability to even have an internal schemata because of that dissolving of the ability to make connections. So if one can't connect, then how does this web or schemata stay in place? And the answer is it doesn't. It is completely shattered and fragmented. And that traumatized person has a difficult time making those connections again. So we'll skip now to page 46 in this chapter, where we're going to see that trauma affects the scope of life and anticipation and future planning, okay? So on page 46, let's see if I can find it here. This is the part about, I think this is the part about constriction. Yeah, the concept of constriction is when the life that was previously completely open to you and you felt that you were really comfortable and you could do lots of different things and you had lots of freedoms and liberties and independences. Constriction actually does what it sounds like. It constricts the scope of your life so much so that those things you once thought possible have now been, you've talked yourself into believing that they are impossible. Constrictive symptoms, this is at the bottom of the page. Constrictive symptoms also interfere with anticipation and planning for the future. So that inability to make connection in tandem with this constricting of life, when a traumatized person, as the chapter points out, when a traumatized person is asked to imagine themselves a year in the future or 10 years in the future or 20 years in the future, if they have constricted the scope of their life so much that they can't see that anymore, they're no longer connected to any hope for the future or any idea for the future. So trauma affects the scope of one's life, how big one allows oneself to think, and then one's ability to anticipate, and that goes back to that lack of preparation. My ability to be prepared for a trauma has been severely compromised, and I now recognize that. I recognize that I was not prepared for what happened to me. And so now that my ability to anticipate anything is messed up. Because I couldn't anticipate trauma, I now can't anticipate other things as well in my life. So that completely breaks down any ability to plan for the future. If you can't make a connection to 10 minutes in front of you, then you can't make a connection to 2 years in front of you. The last thing that I'll point out in my couple of minutes that I've got left is the balance between extremes, and this comes on page 47 at the beginning of that the part of the chapter called the dialectic of trauma. I've already explained the term dialectic to you, so you should have been prepared for this. Prepared. But here's what it's talking about on page 47. The thing that trauma affects is a person's ability to find balance between these two boundaries, in the middle of this dialectic. So, for example, the dialectic between the past and the future. A person is not able to maintain presence in the here and now because they're constantly oscillating or bouncing back and forth between the past and the future. And so what trauma affects, it's the kind of vertigo of that dialectic. You're unable to achieve that middle balance and to see the past in its proper place and the future in its proper place. So instead, you're constantly oscillated back and forth, tossed back and forth between the two with no real security or foundation in the present so as to be able to organize your life into past, present, future. This chapter is chock full of information about how time is also distorted in trauma, because if you can't balance between, for example, the past and the future, then your concept of time is completely thrown off. Your ability to construct a linear narrative that this happened first and then this happened second and then this happened third and then finally this is what's happening now. Your ability to construct that linear narrative is completely obliterated because you have no firm grounding in the present, being oscillated back and forth in this dialectic of past, present, and future. So I hope that my quick and dirty scan through this first part of the chapter has helped you see what some of the things that Herman is bringing out. I look forward to see how you guys incorporate this into your themes. I saw every one of our themes present here, so I'll be interested to see what you pull out of these chapters and synthesize together at the end of the week in your event posting. See you soon.